He thought his father's money would make him untouchable. In class, he raised his hand against his teacher. But at that moment, the door opened, and her military husband entered with their daughter. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning at West Grove High began like countless others, with the hum of adolescent voices weaving through the tiled corridors and the clatter of lockers slamming shut as students grabbed their books in a last-minute rush. The building itself stood like a fortress of concrete and glass, its wide stairwells echoing with the rhythms of sneakers and boots. For most of the students, it was simply another day in the endless cycle of classes, assignments, and gossip. Yet hidden beneath the familiar chaos lay an undercurrent of unease, the kind that most adults in the building chose to ignore. Money, power, and influence had seeped into the school in ways few dared to acknowledge openly. Some teachers turned a blind eye to the arrogance of certain students because they feared the consequences of standing firm. Others whispered their frustrations in the faculty lounge, complaining about how discipline no longer meant anything when a phone call from a wealthy parent could reverse any punishment. Into this charged atmosphere had stepped Miss Valerie Green, the new chemistry teacher. From the moment she walked into West Grove High, she commanded attention, though not through loudness or charm. Her presence was something altogether different. Students felt it instinctively, even if they couldn't articulate it. She carried herself with an authority that seemed carved into her bones, an unwavering posture, eyes that rarely blinked when she fixed them on someone, and a voice that never rose in anger, yet left no room for disobedience. She wore long-sleeved blouses even in the heat of September, her attire simple yet impossibly neat. It wasn't just discipline, it was something deeper, like she was guarding parts of herself from being seen. Some students whispered she had once been in the military. Others guessed she was divorced and hiding scars from an unhappy life. The rumors fed curiosity, but none of the guesses touched the truth. Valerie's arrival had unsettled the balance that West Grove students were used to. For years, one boy had stood at the center of attention in the halls and classrooms, dictating the unspoken rules by sheer force of arrogance. Trevor Miller, 17 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with the permanent smirk of someone who believed the world owed him reverence, had built his own empire within the school. His father, Richard Miller, owned construction firms that sprawled across the city, building entire neighborhoods, stadiums, and office towers. Teachers who dared to confront Trevor often found themselves facing veiled threats or phone calls from administrators, reminding them to tread carefully. Students knew he was untouchable. He mocked those weaker than him, shoved kids into lockers for fun, and laughed when they picked themselves up in humiliation. His group of friends followed close behind, eager to bask in the glow of his untouchable status. At first, Trevor treated Miss Green the way he treated every teacher, as an obstacle to be tested, mocked, and bent until she crumbled under his dominance. But something about her unsettled him. When he tried to throw sarcastic comments across the classroom, she responded with an even, almost surgical precision. She didn't stammer. She didn't look away. She corrected him with such calm certainty that his friends sometimes fell silent, sensing that Trevor had not landed the blow he had intended. Worse still, she often anticipated his disruptions, cutting him off before he had a chance to draw laughter from the room. It was subtle, but in Trevor's mind, it was unacceptable. Students began to notice the tension. They whispered in the halls that Trevor, for all his swagger, seemed different in her class. There was no explosion of laughter when he opened his mouth. No sense that he was in control. Miss Green's sharp eyes pinned him in a way no one else had ever dared, and though he never admitted it, a discomfort stirred in his chest each time she silenced him without raising her voice. That discomfort festered into anger, and with every passing week, it grew harder for him to bear. On one particular Thursday, As students trudged into the chemistry lab, the air seemed charged with more than the scent of disinfectant and chalk dust. The room was lined with heavy wooden tables scarred by years of experiments, Bunsen burners waiting to be lit, and shelves lined with bottles whose faded labels warned of acids and bases that could burn through flesh if misused. It was a place of rules, precision, and quiet focus. Yet within minutes of the bell, Trevor and his friends broke that atmosphere with their usual murmured jokes and laughter, leaning lazily against the counters as if the class existed solely for their amusement. Valerie entered, her steps measured, her eyes scanning the room with the same steady awareness she always carried. The conversations dulled, not because she demanded silence, but because silence followed her like a shadow. She placed her notes on the desk, adjusted her cuffs, and began the lesson without a flicker of hesitation. To the untrained eye, she seemed like a strict but ordinary teacher beginning another day. To the students who had been watching her for weeks, there was something unnervingly precise in the way she held herself. Trevor slouched at the back, arms folded across his chest, his smirk plastered on as always. His friends nudged one another, already anticipating another show. But Miss Green didn't look his way. She spoke about the experiment, her voice calm and clear, describing the reactions they would observe when mixing compounds. For most of the class, her composure was a relief. For Trevor, it was an insult. Every moment she ignored him felt like a challenge. Every second of her control, an attack on his image. The small battles between them had already set the stage. What simmered beneath Trevor's smile was not mischief anymore. It was pride, wounded by the one adult who refused to bend. As the students began to gather equipment, he leaned closer to his group, whispering loudly enough for others to hear, ready to throw another provocation into the air. But before he could, Miss Green turned slightly, her gaze cutting across the room, sharp enough to pin him mid-breath. It was not anger in her eyes. It was something steadier, harder, as if she had looked into far worse than a spoiled teenager. Trevor's grin faltered, if only for a second, but he forced it back, covering his unease with a laugh. The day pressed on, the experiment underway, the scent of chemicals thickening in the room. Yet beneath the surface, the quiet war continued. Students worked nervously, stealing glances at the back of the room where Trevor glared, seething at a teacher who refused to acknowledge his superiority. What no one realized in that moment was that the tension was reaching its breaking point. That Trevor's anger had already hardened into something dangerous, and that within hours, the balance of power at West Grove High would shift forever. The walls of the school, with their faded posters and echoing hallways, had seen fights before. They had heard insults, scuffles, and the arrogance of teenagers convinced of their own invincibility. But never had they witnessed what was about to unfold inside the chemistry lab. Behind the measured tone of Miss Green and the smirk of Trevor Miller, the collision was inevitable. The shadow of her past, so carefully concealed, was about to emerge into the open, and nothing at West Grove would be the same again. The hours that morning unfolded in routine rhythm, but beneath the ordinary surface, something was already straining, preparing to snap. The chemistry lab at West Grove High carried its usual smells of bleach and metallic tang, the faint sting of solvents clinging to the air long after experiments had ended. Rows of heavy wooden counters bore the scars of countless generations of students, burn marks, knife scratches, faint graffiti etched into the surfaces. On the shelves stood jars of reagents, glass tubing stacked carefully, and beakers waiting to be filled. It was a room of order, science, and procedure. Yet on that Thursday, it would become the stage for something raw and human, a clash between arrogance and resolve. Miss Valerie Green moved calmly among the stations, adjusting the burners, reminding students of the safety measures, her presence steady as ever. The students had grown used to her precision, though never entirely comfortable with it. The way she held herself made them straighten unconsciously in their seats, even if they could not explain why. Trevor Miller sat at the back with his friends, pretending to listen, but making no effort to participate. His arms folded, his legs stretched out under the table, his smirk daring the world to tell him otherwise. For days, resentment had been building inside him. He had grown up in a world where his father's name acted like a shield, where teachers hesitated to discipline him, and classmates treated him with a mixture of fear and deference. Authority had always been something that bent under his will. But Valerie Green had resisted. Each time she cut him short, each time she reminded him to focus, each time she showed no trace of fear, she had wounded his pride. Now, as the students lit their burners and leaned over bubbling solutions, his humiliation boiled to the surface. At first, he leaned lazily toward his group, whispering crude remarks meant to draw laughter. Some of the boys chuckled nervously, though not as loudly as usual. The girls at nearby tables exchanged uneasy glances, aware that the air felt heavier, that Trevor's tone was sharper than normal. Miss Green, standing at the front with her notes, did not react. She spoke evenly about the next stage of the experiment, her voice unwavering, her eyes sweeping the room. When her gaze met his, it was calm, unflinching, and that calmness struck him like a blade. His solution on the table began to bubble too rapidly, the flame licking at the bottom of the glass. She glanced toward him and said in her even tone that it was overheating. To anyone else it was a warning, a simple correction to prevent an accident. To Trevor, it was a humiliation. In his mind, she had exposed him in front of everyone. His friends glanced at his table, and their smirks cut into him like knives. Pride, that fragile armor he wore so constantly, cracked beneath the weight of her composure. The moment swelled inside him. His heart beat faster. His jaw tightened, and his hands curled into fists against the counter. He could have let it go. He could have laughed it off. But the poison of entitlement had soaked into him for too many years. He had never been denied, never been made to feel small in public. And now it burned him alive. He pushed his stool back with a screech, the noise jolting the students nearest to him. Heads turned, whispers fluttered, and a silence spread like a shadow through the room. Miss Green stood still, her expression unchanged. She adjusted her cuffs, as though preparing for nothing more than another question. But her eyes remained fixed on him. For a brief moment, Trevor faltered. That gaze held no fear, no hesitation, only a strength he did not understand. It made him feel exposed, as though she had seen straight through the swagger, straight through the money, to the brittle boy beneath. But pride is a cruel master, and Trevor had fed it too long to bow now. With sudden violence, he lunged forward. Gasps echoed across the room, chairs scraped against the floor. A glass beaker tipped and shattered as students stumbled back. His hand shot upward, clamping around Valerie's throat, shoving her against the counter. The impact rattled the glassware, and the hiss of gas from an open valve filled the silence like a sinister warning. For a heartbeat, the world froze. The smirk on Trevor's face twisted into something darker, triumph laced with fury as he tightened his grip. The students stood frozen. Some reached for their phones, but their fingers trembled too much to hold them steady. Others could only stare, their mouths open, unable to comprehend what was happening. Teachers had been shouted at, mocked, even disobeyed. But never before had one been physically attacked like this. And in that unbearable pause, the tension in the room reached its breaking point. The door to the classroom opened. Light from the hallway spilled across the floor, as a tall figure stepped inside. At his side, a little girl clutched his hand, her dark curls bouncing as she peered curiously into the room. They had come with simple intentions. He had wanted to surprise his wife, to show their daughter where her mother worked, to share a brief moment of ordinary family warmth. But the sight that met his eyes erased every trace of gentleness from his expression. Michael Green took in the scene in an instant, his wife pinned against the counter, a boy's hand locked around her throat, students wide-eyed with terror. His military instincts, sharpened by years of service, surged forward before thought could intervene. He released his daughter's hand, and in a single stride crossed the space between them. His arm shot out, prying Trevor's grip from Valerie's neck with brutal efficiency, his body moving with precision that belonged to another world entirely. Trevor staggered as Michael twisted his arm into a hold that brought him down against the table, with a thud that shook the glass. Gasps filled the room again, but this time it was not fear of Trevor. It was awe at the man who had appeared like a force of nature. The little girl clung to the doorway, frightened by the sudden chaos, yet trusting as she watched her father restore order with unyielding control. Valerie coughed, catching her breath. But even in her disarray, she stood straight, her expression steady, eyes burning with quiet fire. She was shaken, but not broken. The presence of her husband beside her only deepened the image of unshakable strength. Trevor writhed beneath Michael's grip, but his struggles were useless. The authority in Michael's posture was absolute, the kind of authority no wealth could ever purchase. He pressed the boy's arm into a position that stripped away his confidence, leaving him exposed and helpless. For the first time in his life, Trevor tasted what it meant to be powerless. His friends shrank back, unwilling to move, unwilling to meet the officer's cold eyes. The classroom, once ruled by Trevor's arrogance, had been transformed in seconds. Students who had always watched him strut with untouchable confidence now saw him reduced to a trembling boy, caught in a storm far greater than himself. They saw Valerie Green not as a cold, mysterious teacher, but as a woman bound to a man whose very presence radiated discipline and strength. The sight of their daughter watching from the doorway added a strange humanity to the moment, a reminder that the woman who had just been attacked was more than a teacher. She was a wife, a mother, someone with a family worth protecting. Silence thickened in the room, broken only by the hiss of the gas valves and Trevor's ragged breathing. No one laughed. No one dared whisper. They watched, transfixed, as the balance of power they had known for years crumbled before their eyes. Trevor Miller, the boy who believed himself untouchable, had been brought low not by wealth or fear, but by a reality he could never have imagined. The experiment tables still glowed faintly with blue flames. The scent of chemicals hung heavy, but it was drowned now by something else. The weight of realization pressing upon every student in that room. They would remember this moment, not as a scuffle or an outburst, but as the instant when the illusion of Trevor's supremacy shattered. Valerie's calm resilience, Michael's decisive strength, and the trembling collapse of the school's most arrogant boy would etch themselves into the memory of West Grove High forever. And yet, this was only the beginning. Outside the walls of the classroom, consequences stirred. Trevor's pride, though broken in front of his peers, still reached for the familiar shield of his father's power. And Richard Miller, accustomed to bending the world with his wealth and influence, was already on his way. What he would find in those halls would force him to reckon with something money could not touch, a reality that would shake his certainty as much as it had shattered his son's. The news of what had happened in the chemistry lab spread through the halls of West Grove High faster than any rumor ever had. By the time the final bell rang that afternoon, the story had grown into something larger than life. Students who had been present told it in hushed voices, their eyes wide as they relived every detail. How Trevor Miller had dared to put his hands on Miss Green, how her husband had appeared at that exact moment, how the boy who had ruled the school with arrogance had been slammed against a desk and left trembling in front of everyone. By evening, even the teachers were whispering about it in the parking lot, speaking cautiously, as if afraid their words might carry further than intended. For once, the Miller name had not silenced the truth. For once, the truth was louder. Inside their home later that night, Valerie sat quietly at the kitchen table with her husband beside her, their daughter already asleep upstairs. Her throat still ached faintly. But her composure remained unbroken. Michael's presence was steady, the calm of a man who had faced chaos before and restored order with his own hands. Neither of them said much. There was no need. What had been revealed in that classroom could not be erased. And though Valerie would have preferred to keep her past and her strength hidden from her students, it was no longer possible. The mask of ordinary routine had been torn away. Now, both she and Michael knew that the next day would bring confrontation not from a boy, but from the world that had always protected him. That world arrived the very next morning. A black SUV rolled into the school parking lot just after classes had begun. Its polished surface gleaming beneath the pale sun, the doors opened with a kind of authority that demanded attention, and out stepped Richard Miller, Trevor's father. He was a man accustomed to command without raising his voice, dressed in a tailored suit that announced both wealth and influence. His expression carried the certainty of someone who believed his will could shape any outcome. He had spent years bending city officials, contractors, and school administrators to his favor, and he intended to do the same again. He walked into the building with long, confident strides, his shoes echoing on the linoleum floors, as teachers and students alike turned their heads to watch. The story of what had happened had already reached him through his son's panicked phone call, though Trevor had colored it with outrage, describing himself as the victim of an unfair assault by a teacher and her husband. Richard had listened with growing anger, the insult to his family name burning more than the thought of physical injury to his son. In his mind, this was not about right or wrong, but about power and humiliation. No one humiliated the Millers without consequence. He found his son waiting in the administrative office, his arm still sore from the hold Michael Green had placed him in. His confidence cracked, though he tried to mask it with bravado. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder and promised, with a look, that justice would be restored, that the people responsible would regret crossing their family. Then he turned toward the hallway, demanding to see the teacher and her husband, who had dared to lay a hand on his son. It was there, in the corridor outside the principal's office, that he came face to face with Michael Green. Michael stood tall, his military uniform pressed with the same precision as his posture, his eyes calm but unyielding. At his side was Valerie, her blouse buttoned to the throat, her gaze steady despite the bruise faintly visible on her neck. They were not loud, they were not defiant, but their presence carried a weight that silenced the hallway. Teachers who had gathered nearby shrank back, sensing the collision about to unfold. Richard Miller began with the authority of a man who expected submission. His voice carried sharpness, his words heavy with accusation and demand. He spoke as if the matter was already decided, as if the teacher and her husband would beg forgiveness for daring to embarrass his son. But as the moments passed, something shifted. He noticed the insignia on Michael's uniform, the calm discipline in his stance, the quiet power in the way he regarded him without flinching. A flicker of doubt stirred. He asked his name, and when the answer came, Green, something inside him faltered. For in this city, and indeed far beyond it, the Greene family name carried its own weight. General Arthur Greene was not a man of wealth, but of history, a figure whose decades of service had etched his name into the very foundations of the military. He was a man whose reputation was one of discipline, loyalty, and honor, and those who crossed him often found themselves silenced not by threats, but by the undeniable authority of his standing. Richard Miller knew that name. He knew it well. And standing before him now was the son of that man, an officer in his own right, backed not by money, but by legacy and respect, earned in ways Richard could never buy. The arrogance in his tone faltered, his words stumbling for the first time in years. The certainty with which he had walked into the school drained away, replaced by a realization as cold as ice. He had overreached. His son had overreached. What had once been a battle he expected to win with ease had become a humiliation he could not escape. The balance of power was not in his favor here. No amount of money, no network of influence could erase the truth of what his son had done, or the reality of the people standing against him. Before the quiet eyes of teachers and administrators, Richard Miller did something he had not done in decades. He lowered his voice. He apologized. The words tasted bitter, but he forced them out, aware that to resist now would bring consequences he could not afford. His son shifted beside him, eyes wide, unable to believe that his father, the man he had always seen as invincible, was bowing his head to anyone. But the message was clear, and it cut deeper than any punishment. Trevor was not untouchable. He never had been. In that moment, the illusion that had shielded him all his life collapsed. His father's power, once the armor he wore with pride, had cracked open to reveal its limits. Across from him stood not people cowed by wealth, but people unshaken by it, bound instead by principles of honor, service, and strength. Valerie Greene, the teacher he had mocked, stood taller than ever in his eyes, not because of her husband or her father-in-law, but because she had never once wavered. She had faced him without fear, and now her steadiness was reflected in the man at her side. The days that followed cemented the change. Whispers in the halls of West Grove High grew into something larger. Students spoke not with fear of Trevor, but with newfound respect for Miss Greene. Teachers who had once turned away found themselves emboldened, reminded that authority did not have to bow to money when discipline and integrity stood firm. Trevor walked the halls no longer as a ruler, but as a boy marked by the memory of his own defeat. His smirk was gone, replaced by silence, his friends keeping their distance as if afraid to share his fall. For Valerie, life did not return to normal, because normal had been left behind. She continued to teach with the same composure, her lessons clear and sharp, her standards unchanged. But now, when she entered a room, silence came not only from fear or mystery, but from respect. Students listened more closely, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because they understood she was not like anyone else who had ever stood at the front of their classroom. Michael returned to his duties, but his presence remained like a shadow over the story, a reminder of what the students had seen. Their daughter, too young to understand the full gravity of what had happened, would one day grow up knowing that her mother had stood her ground, and her father had stood beside her. The legacy of that day would not be written in rumors, but in the lessons that had been carved into every witness's memory. Respect cannot be bought. Authority cannot be faked. Wealth can bend rules and silence voices for a time, but eventually it meets the unshakable wall of character and honor. At West Grove High, that truth had been revealed in the clearest way possible, and those who had seen it would never forget the day when arrogance fell and true respect stood in its place. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.